Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. We'll just wait a couple of minutes for some more folks to join us here. Okay, give it a couple of more seconds before we kick off our webinar today. All right. Well, we're delighted that you've joined us for today's SAMPS webinar. I'm Jasmine Gray, a member of the SAMPS Board of Directors, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. Before we get started with the main event, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about SAMPS. SAMPS stands for Sales and Marketing Professionals in Science. We're an all-volunteer community, now 5,000 members strong, dedicated to helping life science commercial professionals network, learn, and build a competitive advantage in the growth of their careers. If you're not yet a member, joining is quick, easy, and free at samps.org. Please also invite colleagues and industry friends who'd benefit from our community. A few upcoming events that I'd like to make you aware of. The next SAMPS webinar will be on October 9th, and the topic is LinkedIn Mastery for Scientific Sales and Marketing from Profile to Pipeline. And that webinar will be given by Valentina Escobar Gonzalez. Also coming up is our annual SAMPS North American Conference, which will be held on December 3rd and 4th. The theme is the human AI advantage in life sciences sales and marketing. This full-day immersive experience will focus on practical strategies to combine human judgment with AI to improve customer acquisition, experience, loyalty, and win rates. This year's keynote speaker is Stacy Sherman. She's the founder of Doing CX Right, and she's been ranked as one of the global top 30 customer service gurus from 2021 to 2025. I strongly encourage you to view the full agenda on samps.org and register for this event that is only a couple of months away. And now to the webinar. In today's topic, Marina Hopp will be discussing the shift in global research market and how the old US first growth playbooks are wobbling under the budget pressures, regulatory changes, and trade friction. However, with all these challenges comes opportunity. In this session, Marina will focus on how to think differently about your go-to-market plans, build cost-disciplined operating models, and make near-term moves that set you up for long-term wins. I'm pleased to introduce Marina, who has worked as a scientist, a strategy consultant, and a marketer. Nearly 8 years ago, she founded Viveo, a marketing consultancy for life science companies. Marina and the creative team of Gary Books and Chris Rambridge work with startups as well as corporations to deliver pragmatic, creative marketing. Today, she'll wear her strategic hat to discuss how the global research landscape is changing and how marketing and sales teams can respond. Okay, well, with that, I will turn it over to you, Marina.
Thanks, Jasmine, for the very warm welcome. I'm just going to share my screen. There we go. So, our scientific tools and services sector is facing significant headwinds at the moment, largely due to the funding uncertainties in our largest market, the US. Today, I really want to explore with you some of the practical things that you and your company can do in response to this new global research environment. So, before we get started, I'm really curious to hear from you what you believe the future outlook is for the scientific tools and services market. So, I'd like us to turn to a quick poll. Adam, could you please put the poll up on screen for us? So, we have four options there. I'm going to give you about a minute to choose your option, and then we're going to go back to Adam and have a look at the poll results. Okay, how are we doing with the poll? Do we still need some more time, or shall we start to look at the results as they come in? Here we go. Right. So 71% of people agree that the market is experiencing significant challenges at the moment. Good, then you've come to the right place. So I'm going to share with you some of my thoughts in terms of why I think we should be cautious and plan for a less positive market outlook. I think there's been a really fundamental shift in US geopolitics that's going to reshape the scientific sector as we know it. So you're probably aware of the funding cuts. We've already seen grants cut by 1.8 billion. There are proposed grant cuts for the 2026 budget, which will reduce funding levels to levels last seen about 2 decades ago. It's not clear that they will all go ahead, but I think we have to prepare for that possibility. So this reduction in US funding means companies can't really continue to rely on a single dominant market. And we have to look at other regions where there is still spending in research like China, South Korea, Singapore, and the Middle East to make up this shortfall. We're also facing some unfavorable tariff trading conditions, and this is adding cost to doing business in the US. It's really forcing companies to reevaluate their global production networks and their supply chains. And if that wasn't enough, we're looking at established institutions like the NIH and FDA, which are pillars of America's scientific leadership facing political and financial pressures. The NIH is actually the world's largest funder of medical research, and it creates the foundational knowledge that's led to some incredible breakthroughs, things like mAb drugs, CRISPR gene editing, and mRNA vaccines. And these threats to scientific autonomy are undermining science's role, both in terms of its ability to have an influence on policy as well as innovation, which is triggering a brain drain and eroding the US's status as a research powerhouse. All of these factors are coming together and converging to create a systemic effect on the research ecosystem. So when you combine things like government intervention with cautious investment landscape, and macroeconomic pressures like tariffs, inflation, and possible drug price changes, science becomes a less attractive option for young people, and it also drives talent elsewhere. The inevitable result is less research, and less research means less innovation, which has a profound economic impact. There was a really interesting recent report by United for Medical Research, which estimated that for every dollar invested in NIH-funded research, there's $2.56 in economic activity generated. So it means that any reduction in this research funding is going to have a disproportionate effect in the overall economy. So these factors are all converging to create a major shift. As the US begins to lose its dominance as a research funder, the scientific tools and services market is going to fragment into numerous smaller geographic areas of research activity. And this new fragmented market needs a different approach, especially if you're a smaller company. If you're a a large company like Danaher or Thermo Fisher, for example, you're probably less exposed to some of these effects. Most of the larger companies have a global reach and they operate in multiple markets. So it allows them to much more easily adjust their focus to areas where there is funding available. The large companies also have a more diverse revenue stream. So they might be deriving revenues not just from equipment sales, but also from services or diagnostics or applied markets. And they also have global manufacturing and supply chains, so they can more easily shift production to regions that aren't subject to high tariffs. These factors really give them a much greater financial resilience, but that's not the case for some of the smaller companies. So what does it mean if you are a smaller company? I think if you're a smaller company and you're going to survive and thrive, you have to behave more like a camel than a unicorn. You have to be able to endure long stretches with limited resources and be prepared to survive within a much harsher environment than we've experienced for quite a while. So with this camel-like mindset in mind, let's focus on three critical areas. These have been shown to be really helpful when companies are going through difficult times. They are things like strategic clarity, cost discipline, and local execution, and we'll dive into each of them in a bit more detail. So if you're talking about numerous smaller markets, they demand a clear choice in terms of where you're going to play and how you're going to win, because nobody really has the resources to go after more than just a few new geographies on their own. And if you're serving these fragmented markets, it's expensive because you're having to place resources in multiple places. So companies that aren't cost leaders at the moment will have to look at their cost structure. It's also important if you're going to go into a new market to have a culturally diverse market. It depends on having devolved decision making. So you really need people at the local level, feet on the ground, as it were. So let's go into strategic clarity in a little bit more detail. What's it really mean? It's really important that you have a clear vision of who the audience and markets are that you want to go after. Companies should really focus on the target customer segments that align with their strengths and look for geographies where the research spending is still growing. There's going to be greater competition for fewer customers. So having deep customer insight and understanding is really important. It helps you to create a unique value proposition that really sets you apart from your competitors. And it's also really important to conserve resources and focus on investing on areas that have the highest probability of success. It's important to think about how you retain your existing customers because it's much easier to get more revenue from existing customers than to onboard new ones. And also to make strategic cost cuts so that you can continue to deliver customer value. As these costs increase, customers are likely to look for cheaper alternatives. So companies that aren't cost leaders may find this quite difficult. But it's really difficult to become a true cost leader. It takes a lot of time and effort, and it actually requires a particular mindset and system. There's some things about cost leaders that characterize them and differentiate them from other companies. So they typically have a culture that rewards unconventional thinking. They decentralize their decision making, and they find creative ways to deliver what the customers want. They're really good at execution, and it helps them to reduce complexity and keep their costs down. So this might be really quite difficult for other companies to do in the short term. So if your company's not a cost leader, it's probably not the answer. So the strategy might be to play to your strengths and look at how you differentiate yourself and your products. But even then, it's important to take a careful look at the cost base and reduce it where necessary, while still trying to preserve the ability to deliver a differentiated product to your customers. So as companies look for new markets, they'll need to have local execution to really thrive in these new markets. It's really important when you enter a new market to build trust, and this can really only be done by local teams that have cultural fluency. But smaller companies in these markets might find that it's very difficult to do this. One way they can work towards this is having more flexible and quicker decision making at the local level. By flattening the organization and really pushing the decision making to local representatives, they're able to be more responsive and more reactive. But if you can't have local people, it's actually an option to look at having a partner or distributor that can produce and provide this local presence. Although this is going to cost more, some of the additional costs can be addressed by having a blended operating model. And we'll take a look at what a blended operating model looks like. So what does it mean to have a blended model? Well, it's actually a system that combines both centralized execution, local execution, and hybrid operations so that you can bring down costs and serve the local markets better. So some of the functions that benefit from being centralized are things like that scale well or that can be standardized. So some functions that might fit this are IT, marketing, and maybe some of the back office operations. The good thing about digital tools means that it's possible to actually have some hybrid models for certain functions. So for example, you could think about offering virtual training, maybe conducting remote onboarding, or operating a tiered customer service system where maybe the initial queries are handled and triaged centrally, but the actual service engineers are based locally. But there are functions that need people on the ground that have cultural insight and can be responsive to local demands. And some of these functions are things like sales, field service, regional marketing, and compliance. Darwin was reportedly have said that it's not strongest of the species, nor the most intelligent that survives. It's the one that's most adaptable to change. And I think that's a really nice point to lead us into our second poll. So I'd like to know if your company is going to be doing anything different in the next 12 months. Thanks, Adam, for putting the question and the answer options up there. So I'll give you a minute or so just to read through the four options, and then we'll have a little look at the results. So a few more seconds just to pick an answer if you haven't already answered the poll, and then we'll go over to looking at the results. And here they come. That's really interesting. So 31% of people are already taking decisive action to mitigate challenges. Almost 60% are evaluating what the effective course of action might be. And there are a few people, 7% that say they're going to wait and see, and 3% say that they won't do anything differently. So what would we recommend that you do? Well, right now, I think there's some things that you can do immediately. So clarifying your strategy and creating some contingency plans for the worst case scenario. And it appears that a lot of people on the poll today are actually doing that already. So that's really reassuring. I think looking to other geographic markets is important to reduce the dependency on the US. And also thinking about some of the factors we talked about earlier, like launching customer retention initiatives and identifying any immediate cost savings. It's also going to be important to have a look at the supply chain to try and minimize some of the risks and reduce the impact of tariffs. Also, assessing the R&D pipeline is important because this is often a large area of cost for most companies. So if there are any cost savings that can be made, that would be very useful at this time. And also differentiating your offer to gather customer insight and really use that to put some distance between yourself and your competitors. In the next 3 to 6 months, I would suggest you re-examine your cost structure in a little bit more depth, find out ways in which you can be more efficient, and also look at your capital funding and see if you can make that last longer. Maybe taking action to mitigate some of the proposed tariffs There have been a few examples of some very clever product recategorizations that have been used to avoid tariffs or to reduce them. So that might be worth looking into. And also really use your marketing to show value. Focus most of your efforts on value so that you can demonstrate the value that the products provide to your customers, but also take advantage of the downturn to renegotiate with your media partners. There are actually some very good deals available at the moment. It's also helpful to work on ways in which you can help your customers afford your products. So it might be offering a variety of ownership models, maybe leasing and reagent rentals alongside capital purchase, or show additional value by bundling things like service contracts and extended warranties with the product so that you can maintain the price but still provide value to customers. Or reduce costs by offering some of these things remotely, like remote installation or online training or virtual troubleshooting. And if you're a service company, it's worth considering whether you can break projects down into more phases so that the individual payments are smaller and more manageable for clients. It's also important to talk to your investors and to have really open and frequent communication with them because they're probably feeling quite nervous at the moment as well. And it's going to be important to have their ongoing support. In the medium term, it's important to look more closely at optimizing all of your internal processes. There may be places where AI could be useful, where you could improve efficiency by implementing some changes. If you have decided to go into new markets, now's the time to start establishing your presence there. And decentralizing decision making won't only help you in these local markets, but it'll also help the overall organization be more responsive to market changes. If you do have new products coming through your pipeline, is it possible to bring forward any of those that address cost efficiency challenges for your customers, especially if they help R&D functions within pharma and biotech to reduce their cost base? And we have seen that recently raising capital is taking a lot longer. So start the next funding round at least 6 to 9 months earlier than you normally would. So these are some of the things that we suggest companies should take a look at. I think that we're really facing a set of circumstances that we haven't seen before. It's really uncharted territory, and companies that will survive and thrive are the ones that recognize the shift and start their planning now. So I'm sure that you have a lot of questions. I'd encourage you to ask them through the chat, and I'm going to hand over to Jasmine to take us through the Q&A now, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you, Marina, for all those insights. I found the polling questions or the answers to the polling questions, particularly the second one, super interesting. What do you make of the fact that it seems like the majority of the audience is prepared or on their way to being prepared to have an action plan?
I think that's very reassuring because while we haven't seen revenues decrease dramatically over Q1 and Q2 of this year, I think that I have to caution that they are reflective of what happened maybe 3 quarters ago when the purchase intent was there, because the purchase cycle is so long that we're not really seeing revenues being affected. But I feel that everybody thinks that that's going to change. And it's really reassuring to see them planning ahead. I wish I had the opportunity to ask more detailed questions. I'd love to know from the audience where their biggest changes are coming. Are they more strategic or are they more operational? So it would be fascinating to go into that in a little bit more detail.
Have you seen anything from your clients that sort of give you an indication of whether it's strategic, tactical, or maybe a hybrid?
I think it depends on the sector that they're operating in. I have seen and had far more strategic questions. So people are really going back to fundamentals and saying, are we serving the right markets in the right way? Are our products really doing what we want them to do? And, are our product roadmaps robust going forward so that the investment that we are planning to make in things like R&D will have the returns that we expect. So I think it's a much more deliberate decision on how money is being spent. And I think I've seen people reverting much more to fundamentals and saying, basically, are we doing the right thing? Is our operational cost structure correct? Are we heading in the right direction in terms of our strategy? So I think those questions are much more fundamental than we maybe saw a year or so ago.
Yeah, makes sense. So we have a question from one of the attendees. If you decentralize decision making, how do you make sure that it doesn't impact the company culture that may be a big part of a company's differentiator?
That's a really tricky thing to do to keep that company culture. And I think the way in which I've seen it done most successfully has been for people from, let's say, head office to go to the regions and spend time there, whether it's on secondment or contract, but also to give people the opportunity to come to the headquarters. It's one of those things where face-to-face interaction is really important. To simply expect a division or a region to absorb the culture via Zoom is very difficult to do. So I think, again, having somebody that can take that strong central culture and bring it into a region is really important.
Another question here, how does a small life sciences tools company execute on this? Signing up a new distributor can be challenging. It often takes 6 months to a year to do.
Yes, I can't deny that it's incredibly challenging. But I think it's important to, one, get some help to find the right distributor partner, and then also to, keep at it really, and make sure that you really support that distributor. There's actually a company that has a very interesting operating model at the moment, which is offering distributor support. Now, that might sound a bit strange, but usually you have the company with the product and the distributor who's selling it. And this company is acting as a bridge between the two to make sure that the distributor is trained, they understand the company well, that the company understands the distributor and the region that they're operating on. It's not a service I've seen before, so it was very unique when I came across this company. And I think there's a demand for that, for acting as a bridge to help make this relationship much smoother and function much better.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. Can you mention who that company is?
I can probably do that offline.
Perfect. Okay. Can you speak to the current market where local suppliers are experiencing increased ghosting from leads? For example, trade shows where there's a positive conversation often ends up in ghosting. My clients are finding this too often.
Yes, it's very difficult. I think we have to change our perception of what we expect from trade shows. Um, I think too often we think that they're going to be opportunities to generate leads. And I think in this cautious environment, there's a lot more work required before that interaction becomes a lead. So we're certainly seeing potential customers wanting much more evidence that the product is going to be valuable for what they're wanting to do. And while they might be enthusiastic at a trade show, it's probably important to have some other things in your marketing arsenal that will help answer the questions that they might have. And I think an approach to trade shows which is useful is to break that purchase journey down and really try to pinpoint more closely where the customer is in that journey before assuming that because they've shared their contact details, they might be ready to purchase or they might be a warm lead. And in fact, there might be more stepping stones that you have to put in place before they get to the point where they're ready to buy.
Are European countries also part of the regions where US companies should consider decentralization?
I think there are pockets. Certainly, the European Union has an initiative to attract scientists into the European Union, and France has an initiative called Safer Place for Science. So yes, there are pockets of investment, certainly in countries like Belgium. There's a very thriving biotech industry there with a lot of government support. But I do think the difference is that the European Union is not homogenous, and each country does have a very specific culture and way of doing business. So again, companies are looking at this fragmentation. In order to serve those different markets, they're going to have people with local understanding, and a different approach. Doing business in Belgium is very different to doing business in France, even though they might speak a common language.
Yeah. Are there any specific steps you would recommend for hedging on currency conversions? It's difficult right now to predict where currency conversions might be tomorrow.
I must admit, I'm not a financial advisor, so I would feel very uncomfortable giving an answer to that. I would say speak to somebody that's far more well-read and versed in this area than I am.
Yeah, I thought that might be your response, but figured I'd give it a try.
I'd hate to give
Suppliers,
advice.
yeah. Suppliers are doing this. They don't get the chance to have these needed and additional conversations. I think that customers are terrified of losing their jobs, which results in not wanting to introduce anything new.
And I think that's a very natural reaction. You know, as you say, if they're concerned about their own jobs, they wouldn't want to take any risks. And in my previous answer, I said, you know, I think it's really important that we look at this purchase journey in a lot more detail, and we break it down into lots of different steps. So something that we've done for one of our clients was to really look at each of the objections that might be raised at these different stages in the purchase journey, and then provide marketing materials and collateral for the salespeople to help address those objections. And that helps to build trust and give reassurance. So if you're able to show data and show proof of how the product will add value, I think that helps to overcome some of these things. But it is a tough market, and I acknowledge that it's not always easy for companies to get beyond that when people are feeling fearful about their jobs.
Do you think that there are any take-home messages from the market's responses in the early days of COVID that we could apply to today?
That's an extremely interesting question. And probably one I should give more thought to, really, because I don't want to give a flippant answer. Um, I think the similarities are very much this uncertainty about the future, the uncertainty about how long it might last. And so I feel that they probably are lessons that we could learn from how we dealt with that. Um, but again, I'd like to give it more thought. I don't want to give a flippant answer.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, and we have one more question here. Do you have any guidelines about exploring serving markets outside the US and Europe, for example, Asia or the Middle East or South Africa?
I think there's not one set of guidelines that will help address all of those, but if I pulled out just a few principles, I would say the majority of those, if I take the Middle East, for example, so Dubai has an incredibly big science park there with about 100 different science companies, biotechs and so on. Saudi Arabia is investing heavily. All of these Middle Eastern countries have very large sovereign wealth funds that they're putting a lot of money into, moving them away from reliance on oil. But to do business in any of these areas, you really need a local introduction. So you need somebody who can, who's well known and well respected, that can introduce you there. And I think a similar thing is true in Asia. So I would say, if you can, look for introductions to people locally that can then introduce you to these companies. And again, that's why I've emphasized a lot in the presentation, having some sort of local presence is really important. Without it, it's really difficult to open those doors.
Mhm, mhm. Going back to the previous question This person asks, what in your view could we have learned from the 2008 recession that impacted the US? And are there any similarities to now?
When I looked at some of the factors that help companies survive, I actually went back to work that was done around the dot-com boom in the early 2000s, so 2002, and what happened in the financial crisis of 2008, and really pulled from that the emphasis on a much deeper strategic focus, cost differentiation, and this ability to execute locally. So those were really three lessons that were drawn from those particular challenging financial conditions. I didn't find anything that was really written specifically for life science and bioscience, and had to rely a lot on my own personal experience during that time. So yes, I do think there are lessons that can be learned. I think having a fundamentally more strategic approach and really examining everything that you do and making sure that it's having an impact is really important. So yes, I guess that would be my short answer.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Marina, for sharing your insights and for describing this uncharted territory that we're all involved with right now. I also appreciate all of you who've joined us today. Don't forget that we have another webinar coming up in a few weeks on October 9th. Please don't forget to register for that, as well as for the annual North America event. And I wish everybody a great day and look forward to seeing you on another SAMPS event again soon. Thank you. Bye.